I don't think I've ever had such a marvelous, complex, thorough, and respectful introduction. Thank you so much, Rod. And he also makes a mean chicken and mango. What was that?
Mango papaya.
Mango papaya. Yeah, chicken over rice. Oh, they have been feeding me good the past 2 days. And then there's the lemon tart. I mean, we won't even go there. So I'm very, very happy to be in Ottawa. There's always a magnificent crowd here, and it's just beautiful to have this as the last date on this particular tour, which started on April 11th, and well, it's not quite finished yet. I still have 2 more dates in Vancouver and 1 in Victoria, but in terms of this whole leg outside of my province, it's been quite an adventure. Everything from intimate backyard gatherings to 100 people in Toronto, and then Ottawa, where, you know, it's much more intimate and I know more people here, and I'm just really excited to be concluding the eastern leg of the tour here. So what's also exciting is that not only am I going to read a short piece from Catalyst, but I'm also going to read a few poems from Steve Kulash and Other Autopsies. And I was just saying to Liz, I've always wanted a book called Steve. So there we go. Steve Kulash was an actual man. He was the taxidermist who worked on Kingsway and died in a fire because he couldn't get out of the taxidermy shop for some reason, like there was a whole bunch of taxidermied animals piled against the door. So he died as he lived. So this piece is the title piece, Steve Kulash, Taxidermist. Nostalgia is unethical. If this is finally the end of my childhood. On Kingsway, the taxidermist shuts down. Display cases of skulls, dust-stuffed quails, and white-tailed deer emptied out. I loved those windows of death. This is how you get old, saying, "Where are the merry-go-rounds?" All those corrupt, dangerous, cheap things I lived for. Life always takes more of a risk back then. Is neon or crinoline or salmon bloodying the banks with their too muchness? Drawers and drawers of glass eyeballs, plastic claws by the bucketful. If the imagination accretes around this, I apologize for the lack of romance. Memory has an immoral tinge. It wants its cold beasts to worship. Thank you so much, Amanda and Charles, for putting this book out. The cover is a photograph I took of a crow tree down by the Fraser River, and there was some crazy process involved in painting over it and photographing it, and it just turned out gorgeously. And I just encountered it, you know, a few minutes ago, so it's like I might stroke it. I'm going to read 3 haibans in honor of the wonderful Japanese work that we just heard, and the fact that you are in attendance, and your work too, Terry-Ann. Very happy to be reading with you. And lots of people are very sad that you are leaving. I did a writers group this morning, Ruby Tuesday, and some people did not know that Terry was leaving, and it was quite a shock. Yeah, so, yeah, they didn't know. So you will be missed. So these 3 haibans, which, for those of you who don't know, are paragraphs followed by haikus, essentially prose paragraphs and haikus at the end, were written at a time, I think it was around 2008, when I was on tour with my last band, and I was on tour with a bunch of young men who aggravated me in multiple ways. And I tended to plummet from time to time into this melancholic state where I was feeling the ennui of the road, and also perhaps of shifting out of this phase of my existence and maybe wanting to move into another plane, but not quite there yet. So I'm just going to read these 3 pieces in a row. Haiban for 3 places we didn't stop. We were driving from Edmonton to Winnipeg. Cut Knife, Esterhazy, and Minnedosa. We did not stop in those places. On the flat map of the land between refineries and wheat, a dot of us traveling, butterflies collaging their deaths to the silver-grilled canvas. And when we park for lunch at Timmy's, the wasps descend, assuaging their silken hungers as we feast on the emptiness. 4 minor people amid the combines and grain elevators, an orgy of instruments in the cab, heading to Winnipeg's bandaged stages and those small, immense instances of epiphany. We make up haikus as we drive, syllables, long miles on our fingers. Haibun for September 1st. It's not over yet. The heat, the melee of salt and sand in every day's wild pour, but a chill's already begun, lying like age beneath the sunbeams. And you read Sarton about turning 70 instead of Nin's journal of lasciviousness, feeling everything you've accomplished being translated into pain. Or maybe you're just alone too much as the alder golds itself with dying, and there is no snow yet to present its animal cuneiform, the mystical, distant language of birds. From the mountain ash, berries flame in their clusters, fall solo as blood. Haibun on driving towards Calahoo. Nearly too late for another road trip. Nearly too late for everything, it seems. Rain sluicing through fog over Box Canyon, the half-life of family behind us. No one is who they think they are. You are not a beautiful man. You are a boy, transparent and terrible as light. Well, I am no longer young as, in the truck loaded down with music and dreams and thwarted love, we leave what we were born for, the graffiti and fire of the stage, past Cache Creek, scream through Sangudo, keeping pace with the Wiggle Chips truck, just as far as the borders of autumn. Silence the whole way home. Guess we've spoken summer, all its melting words. And I feel Charles clicking, and I know I'm gonna just, he's a terrific photographer, but I'll still load the pictures. Reading phase. Okay, I'm gonna finish the section of poems by reading Freaks. I was doing a lot of research into Freaks for a couple of years. And I never ended up finishing the manuscript, and it just kind of morphed into a couple of poems. And this one was written when I was in New York in 2008. And I was imagining what it would have been like if I had been part of Barnum and Bailey's Freak Show. Because when I was born, I had a tooth coming out of the roof of my mouth. And, you know, this day and age, we just remove these things. But, you know, I thought, well, what if they hadn't removed it? And back then, I could have been a kind of a freak. You know, not just a poet, an actual freak. So I thought that would have been an interesting community to be part of. So this is Freaks. On the subway over the Hudson, an armless man puffs into the harmonica slotted into its yoke around his neck. And pitying his lack of prosthetics, passengers drop pennies in his Starbucks cup, stare out the graffitied glass at the black wake behind him. There is no longer any fanfare for his strangeness, his Darwinian predicament. Once Barnum and his freaks took to the rails, a herd of wonders clacking from Mississauga to Minneapolis. Fats, dwarfs, giants, tribes, Jojo the dog-faced boy, Admiral Dot the midget, Jane DeVere, whose 14-inch beard flowed darkly over her corset. 3 rings of lyphodermal limbs, double vaginas, and ectrodactylic hands, posing in Eisenman's faux parlors on the Bowery wearing real furs, taking tea with Queen Victoria, whose boudoir flaunted its own pickled punk amid snuff and fans. We have laser machines, wax, and scalpels so that, smooth, proportioned, we can attain to the level of technicians, programmers, torn from the noble pantheon of curiosities, birthed into the invisible world of acceptance. Oh, why didn't they let me live in another century? Stay bird woman, alligator girl, with my extra set of molars, that one incisor that stuck out from my palate, waiting for its untenable shell. How I would have boxed with Zip the Pinhead, quaffed one back with Lobster Man, lolled about with corpulent Blanche. Then every night, the gilded applause as I parade in my cage, sweet princess of feathers, will now, extracted, braced, perfected, I am lonely. So when I was on the train, which is ridiculously long between St. Catharines and Ottawa, I had a seatmate who talked to me very briefly because he was usually in front of his laptop. And I said I was on a book tour and, you know, I'd go from town to town on the train or bus or whatever. And he just looked at me and said, "How can you endure it?" Which is like the worst thing in the world I could possibly be doing, was taking the train and bus to read poetry to people, you know. It's like, I don't know how. It's a total, no, it's not a total joy. It's a joy. We won't get that extreme. So I'm going to read you a short piece from Catalyst, Confrontations with the Muse, which came out a month ago now. And it's essays and memoirs that I've collected over the past 12 years, and Noelle Allen at Woolsack and Wynne has graciously produced a book out of. And they range all over the place, from memories of my childhood to my obsession with children's literature, to pilgrimages I took to southern France to foolishly look for troubadours, to touring a book across this country from one end to the other. And it ends with a critical piece about environmental Canadian poetry, and whether it's nature poetry, whether it's ecological poetry. So it goes all over the place, but mostly it's concerned with that ephemeral, ineffable thing called the muse, which has seemed to obsess me in all its variant forms for a very long time. So I'm going to read the piece that I wrote last year, trying to understand a little bit why I'm so obsessed with the muse and what are the different muse figures I've had, and I don't know, trying to make some sense out of it all, which is a crazy thing to do. So this is called The Muse, a Teasing Out. Well, I can recall with sweet precision the first time I felt struck by what I later called the muse. Dragged outside of myself and driven to research and write from this particular source with what was, perhaps paradoxically, an intense abandon, a reckless focus. I can't remember when I initially encountered the notion of the muse itself with all its modern iconoclasm. It wasn't through a study of the 9 muses of Greek myth and their ambiguous capacity to both inspire and ruin. Nor was it in Homer's Odyssey or Dante's Inferno. It certainly wouldn't have been in the book still most illustrative of our contemporary comprehension of the muse, namely, The White Goddess, a historical grammar of poetic myth by Robert Graves. A terrifying figure he described as the person who makes poets write poems, and she puts them through ordeals and gives them a hell of a time, in an interview with Leslie Norris in The Listener. I do recall reading Paradise Lost early in my college years and coming across Milton's invocation, "Sing, heavenly muse," being moved by this idea of a poet beseeching a transcendent entity to bequeath him the powers of creation. But I highly doubt the thought that I was about to pursue a muse, or more accurately have a muse consume me, crossed my mind when Egon Schiele's volume of poetry and paintings, I, Eternal Child, lunged at me from the shelves of the Burnaby Public Library in 1996. As Francine Prose states in her fascinating study, The Lives of the Muses, 9 Women and the Artists They Inspired, the muse has always been associated with what cannot be summoned at will and seems beyond the artist's control. Traditionally speaking, this meant the ineffable descent of a beautiful but somehow unattainable woman. A vision that floated before the male artist, then away. The exquisite brevity of the muse's entrance, or else her appearance at a crucial stage of transformation in the artist's life, as with Maud Gonne or Dante's Beatrice, enabling her to inspire a frenzy of creating. Her influence was never fleeting or superficial, but hovered in an eternal aura over the remainder of the artist's works, and even over his life, affecting him at a depth he would have been otherwise incapable of relinquishing himself to. For a female artist, there are few prototypes of women inspired by muses and no archetypes at all. We continue to accept the role of emblem or catalyst more readily than that of wholly engaged creator. However, the irony is that when it comes to the muse, one is actually more passive than active before him or her. The living or dead source that charges one with a fire of language or colors or melodies. The muse enters one at a somatic level, harder and stronger than desire, and compels one to become a channel, a passage for what can later appear to be an absurd or even insane number of works. Know anything about that, Rob? It's so true. Scarcely macho, this yielding. One must open before a force that may have little that is rational, logical, or even healthy about it. Sounds like a slightly less cheesy, darker version of a Harlequin cover, but essentially that's what occurs. The hard work of crafting is never elided, but the anxiety of subject matter dissolves in this incessant surge of material. A wave of producing that can feel like possession, both exhilarating and disruptive, can feel at the time as if it will be endless, a constantly renewable trove, can feel freeing and suffocating in equal measures, a delirium that restrains self-criticism, necessarily, dangerously, can feel like joy. Something happened when I opened that Shield volume I had never before experienced, but from that day on would know again. With the poetry of Robinson Jeffers, with the life of Frank Bonville, with troubadour culture, and most recently with the pioneer photographer Matty Gunchman. It was visceral, musical, it seemed irrevocable. Francine prose de-romanticizes the muses by describing them as mere instruments that may speed and facilitate the artist's labors. Conversely, Kate Braid, in an essay titled Illuming the Muse, Women's Poetry in the Age of Disillusionment, or Looking Behind the Mask of Muse and Mostly Keeping My Sanity, calls her years spent writing poems on Glenn Gould as violent, as passionate, and utterly absorbing as a love affair. Muses, yes, like the often jealous and vengeful goddesses of Greek lore, can truly demand a kind of pure allegiance from the artist, a total commitment and a fidelity that can rupture other prior and lesser bonds. But in return, one is given the hope of song. In Hesiod's words, "Happy he whomsoever the muses shall have loved, sweet is the sound that flows from his mouth." Contrast such a refreshing belief system with the cynical numbness related in Arlene Crochet's 1996 article in The New Yorker, in which she claims that making art and thinking about art are increasingly wistful, not to say futile occupations. We don't know who the muse is anymore, and we may never know. Must we know? I may tease the muse out a little, but it slips quickly back behind its veils, its shadows, its rosy or storm-rich clouds. And yet the simple principle remains for me: trust. If I follow, I can trust that it will return. If you call, you beautiful, dooming, luminous muse, whatever, whomever you may be, I'm there. Thank you very much.